My parents stole my $15,000 chemo fund for my sister's wedding videos. That was the exact thought looping in my mind as my mother Beverly stood in my living room, twirling my spare apartment key around her manicured index finger. I was 33 years old, sitting on my sofa with a freshly surgically implanted chemo port aching in my upper chest, scheduled to begin my first round of poison at 7 a.m. the next morning. Beverly didn't bring soup, she didn't bring comfort, and she certainly didn't bring a mother's warmth. She brought Felicity. My younger sister stood behind her, adjusting the strap of a designer bag that probably cost more than my entire medical deductible, looking mildly inconvenienced by the smell of antiseptic that lingered in my small apartment. "It's already done, Hazel," my mother said, her voice dropping into that calm, authoritative register she reserved for church board meetings and family dismissals. "I went to the bank this morning and initiated the transfer from the old joint account. You know, the one you never took my name off of since college." I stared at her, the physical throb in my chest momentarily eclipsed by the sheer, breathless audacity of her words. "That was my emergency fund," I said, my voice intentionally low, refusing to give them the hysterical reaction they were bracing for. "That was for my chemotherapy, the out-of-pocket costs, my rent while I can't work." Felicity sighed, rolling her eyes as she checked her phone. "Oh, please, Hazel, don't be so dramatic," she muttered, not even looking up from her screen. "You're going to be lying in a hospital bed or on this couch for the next 6 months anyway. It's not like you're going anywhere or doing anything that requires 15 grand in liquid cash. Greg and I need that money for the deposit on the Miami media team. Do you know how hard it is to book a premium drone videographer this close to the wedding?" I looked from my sister's perfectly contoured face to my mother's unyielding gaze, realizing in real time that they did not see me as a dying woman, nor even as a human being. I was merely a misplaced asset they had corrected. Before I tell you what I did next, I need you to tell me in the comments where you are watching this from, because it still baffles me that family dynamics can be this universally toxic, no matter where you live in the world. As the silence in my living room stretched, the humiliation began to settle deep into my bones. Beverly took a step closer, smoothing the invisible wrinkles on her pristine silk blouse. "You have always been so selfish, Hazel," she said, shaking her head in profound disappointment. "Your sister is marrying a brilliant cryptocurrency entrepreneur. This wedding is a high society event in the Bahamas. It is an investment in our family's future. What are you doing with your life? Freelance video editing? Playing on your little computer in this cramped apartment? You should be proud to contribute to something bigger than yourself." The gaslighting was so practiced, so flawless, that for a fraction of a second, the old me, the obedient foundational daughter who had spent 33 years shrinking so Felicity could shine, almost apologized. But the newly installed port in my chest gave a sharp, agonizing twinge, reminding me that I was quite literally fighting for my life. "You stole $15,000 from a cancer patient," I stated, stripping away the familial dressing and presenting the raw, ugly truth. Beverly's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing as she stepped into my personal space. "I reallocated family resources," she corrected coldly. "You will figure it out. You always figure it out. You're strong, Hazel. You don't need coddling. Felicity needs a flawless wedding day. And honestly, it's just $15,000. Greg will probably make that back in a day once his new crypto token launches, and maybe we'll pay you back then." She dropped my spare key onto the glass coffee table with a harsh, dismissive clatter. "Don't bother calling the bank to stop it. The wire has already cleared. We have a flight to Nassau to catch in 3 hours. Felicity finally looked up, offering a sickeningly sweet, pitying smile. "Good luck with the chemo tomorrow, Hayes. Drink lots of ginger ale. I'll text you pictures of the beach." They didn't wait for a response. They simply turned around, the soft clicks of their expensive heels echoing against my hardwood floors, leaving me alone in the suffocating quiet of my living room. They didn't scream. They didn't throw things. They simply gutted my survival fund with the casual indifference of someone swatting away a fly. I didn't cry. I didn't chase after them down the hallway. I sat perfectly still, listening to the heavy front door latch shut, locking me inside with my illness and my empty bank account. The betrayal was so absolute, so surgically precise, that it cauterized the wound instantly. In that deafening silence, staring at the key my mother had discarded, the dutiful, self-sacrificing daughter died. She was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity that frightened even me. If they believed I was strong enough to survive cancer without a dime, they were right. But they fundamentally misunderstood what that strength would look like when it was no longer protecting them. I slowly reached for my laptop, the screen illuminating my face in the dimming light of the apartment, and I made a quiet promise to the empty room that I would not only survive this poison, but I would build an empire out of the ashes they left behind, and I would make them pay for every single cent. The alarm clock on my nightstand did not blare. It simply vibrated against the dark mahogany wood at exactly 5 in the morning, a soft, mechanical hum that signaled the beginning of the most solitary day of my life. I lay there in the heavy silence of my bedroom, watching the gray pre-dawn light struggle to filter through the blinds, feeling the strange, alien pressure of the chemo port sitting just beneath the skin of my chest like a buried coin. There was no one in the kitchen making me tea, no one warming up the car in the crisp morning air, no one pacing the hallway with nervous energy to ensure I was ready for the battle ahead. There was only me, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the other room, and the chilling reality that my mother and sister were currently boarding a first-class flight to the Bahamas, funded by the very money meant to keep me alive. I forced myself out of bed, my feet hitting the cold, hardwood floor, and walked to the bathroom mirror, staring at the 33-year-old woman looking back at me, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the exhaustion that seemed permanently etched into her jawline, a byproduct of a lifetime spent playing the unbreakable foundation for a family that viewed her simply as structural support. I dressed meticulously, choosing a pair of tailored charcoal slacks and a soft cashmere oversized sweater that would allow the nurses easy access to my chest, refusing to look like a victim even as I walked into an oncology ward, because the women in my lineage were taught that appearance was armor, even if that armor was currently shielding a completely hollowed-out soul. The drive to the hospital was a blur of empty streets and blinking yellow traffic lights, the city still asleep while my entire universe was being violently rearranged, the heater in my car doing nothing to dispel the deep, bone-deep cold that had settled inside me since my mother dropped that spare key on my glass coffee table. When I pulled into the bleak, concrete labyrinth of the hospital parking garage, the isolation truly hit me, a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders as I watched elderly patients being guided by devoted spouses and young adults being flanked by fiercely protective parents, all of them walking through the sliding glass doors into the cancer center as united fronts. I walked in alone, clutching my leather tote bag containing my laptop, a water bottle, and a stack of medical bills I now had zero means to pay, the harsh fluorescent lights of the waiting room washing over me as the receptionist, a kind-eyed older woman with a name tag that read Brenda, gave me a sympathetic smile when I checked the box indicating I had no emergency contact present. The chemotherapy suite was a large, sterile room filled with reclining leather chairs, the rhythmic beeping of IV pumps, and the low, hushed murmurs of people confronting their own mortality, an environment that smelled distinctly of rubbing alcohol, warm blankets, and the metallic tang of chemical survival. A nurse named Yvette, a sharp, observant woman in her late 50s, whose gentle hands contradicted her no-nonsense demeanor, guided me to a chair by the window, her brow furrowing slightly when she realized there was no one pulling up a visitor's chair beside me, though she had the grace not to ask the question that hung heavily in the clinical air. "This first one is going to feel a little cold, sweetheart, and you might get a strange metallic taste in the back of your throat, but I've got you," Yvette murmured as she sterilized the skin over my port, her voice carrying that specific, soulful maternal warmth that my own mother had always withheld from me, reserving it entirely for Felicity's minor inconveniences. The needle punctured the port with a sharp, localized pinch, and within seconds, the icy reality of the poison began flowing into my bloodstream, a literal chill tracing the path of my veins, freezing me from the inside out, while I stared out the window at the bleak morning skyline. It was in that exact moment of intense physical vulnerability, with toxic chemicals dripping into my heart to save my life, that my phone vibrated in the side pocket of my tote bag with a rapid, unrelenting sequence of notifications. I pulled the device out with a heavy hand, unlocking the screen to find that I had been added to a new group chat aggressively titled Felicity's Island Fairy Tale, a digital space populated by my mother, my sister, my future brother-in-law Greg, and several of their wealthy, superficial friends who had no idea they were witnessing a crime scene. The first image loaded on my screen, blindingly bright and saturated with color, Felicity, standing on a pristine white sand beach in Nassau, wearing a custom bridal bikini and holding a crystal flute of champagne, the turquoise ocean stretching out endlessly behind her, untouched by the harsh realities of the world. Below the photo was a text from my mother, Beverly, her words dripping with that signature, polished passive aggression she wielded like a scalpel. Just touched down in paradise, so incredibly grateful for the family who contributed to making Felicity's dream a reality, even those who couldn't be here in person today. I stared at the screen as another video loaded, this one taken by the very drone videography team my chemotherapy money had allegedly paid for, sweeping over a luxury private villa, capturing Greg laughing on a balcony, looking every bit the arrogant, self-proclaimed cryptocurrency genius he marketed himself as online. He was a man who wore expensive watches and tailored linen suits, always speaking in vague, grandiose terms about blockchain investments, Web3 integration, and decentralized wealth, yet somehow always needing to borrow my sister's credit cards when a temporary liquidity issue supposedly locked up his offshore assets. I didn't type a response. I didn't leave the group chat. I didn't block their numbers. Instead, I sat perfectly still in that medical recliner, letting the cold poison drip into my veins, while a different kind of poison, a cold, calculated, and absolute finality, seeped into my mind. I was hyper-aware of the silence within myself, the profound absence of the familiar urge to defend myself, to argue, to scream into the void from my mother's love, realizing that fighting for her affection was a losing game I had played for 3 decades, a rigged casino where the house, Felicity, always won. The profound tragedy wasn't just that they stole $15,000 from a dying woman. It was that they genuinely, deeply believed I would simply absorb the blow, process the trauma in silence, heal myself without inconveniencing them, and eventually crawl back to Sunday dinners with a smile, ready to praise Felicity's wedding photos, because that was the role I had been conditioned to play, the emotional shock absorber for their narcissism. As the medication continued to flow, leaving a bitter, ashy taste in the back of my mouth, I felt a single, hot tear slip down my cheek, catching on the collar of my cashmere sweater, a tear that was not shed for my cancer, nor for my empty bank account, but rather a final, definitive mourning for the mother and sister I was choosing, right in this cold white room, to bury while they were still breathing. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, my posture straightening against the leather chair, and I opened my laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating my face as I logged directly into my compromised banking portal to do what I did best: investigate the raw data. As a freelance video editor and digital media strategist, my entire career was built on piecing together disjointed fragments of digital information into a cohesive narrative, analyzing metadata, tracking digital footprints, and finding the story hidden within the pixels. I pulled up the wire transfer receipt my mother had initiated that morning, downloading the PDF and scrutinizing the routing numbers, the receiving institution, and the transaction IDs, refusing to believe the narrative she had spoon-fed me in my living room. Something about her excuse had felt too rehearsed, too specifically tailored to incite my guilt over the wedding, And as I traced the receiving bank's routing number, my fingers flying across the keyboard despite the growing numbness in my arms, I discovered the first loose thread of a massive, ugly tapestry. The $15,000 had not been wired to a premium media production company in Miami as they claimed. The routing number belonged to a high-risk commercial holding account registered in Delaware under the name Apex Horizon Ventures, an LLC that, after a quick search through public business registries, was directly listed under Gregory T. Vance, my soon-to-be brother-in-law. I sat back, the rhythmic beep of the IV machine providing a metronome for the rapid calculations firing in my brain as the pieces clicked perfectly into place, revealing a truth far more sinister than a spoiled bride demanding an expensive drone video. Greg was not hiring a videographer with my money. He was aggressively covering margins, plugging a financial leak in his supposedly booming crypto empire, using stolen funds laundered through my mother's blind, desperate adoration for him and my sister. Beverly had not just stolen my emergency fund for vanity. She had committed financial fraud across state lines to bail out a man who was clearly running a shell game. A man she was so desperate to claim as a high-status son-in-law that she was willing to sacrifice her actual daughter's life to maintain his illusion of wealth. The sheer audacity of it all was breathtaking, a masterclass in manipulation. But they had made one fatal, irreversible miscalculation. They assumed I was just a freelance video editor playing on a little computer, completely unaware that I possessed the precise digital forensics skills necessary to dismantle Greg's entire digital existence, bite by bite. As Yvette came over to check my vitals, her warm hand resting briefly on my shoulder, she asked if I was feeling all right, noting the intense focus in my eyes as I stared at the lines of corporate registry data scrolling across my screen. I looked up at her, my expression utterly calm, the terrified, abandoned daughter completely erased and replaced by a woman who had just found her purpose, her battleground, and her absolute salvation in the data. "I'm perfectly fine, Yvette," I said, my voice steady, smooth, and laced with a quiet, terrifying grace. "In fact, I think I'm finally starting to see things clearly for the first time in my life." Over the next 4 hours of that infusion, while my body waged a microscopic war against rogue cells, my mind was giving birth to what would soon become Vanguard Digital Strategy, a firm born not out of ambition, but out of necessity, vengeance, and a profound demand for justice. I mapped out a meticulous blueprint right there in the chemo chair, drafting the foundational structure of a data auditing and digital intelligence agency, utilizing my existing network of independent tech contractors, forensic accountants I had previously done video work for, and cybersecurity experts who owed me favors. I knew I couldn't confront them now, not while I was sick, vulnerable, and entirely broke. I needed time to heal, time to build power in the shadows, and time to let Greg's inevitable financial hubris bloat to a point where his collapse would be catastrophic. I needed them to believe they had gotten away with it, to let them enjoy the Bahamian sun, to let them toast to their fake wealth, and to let them comfortably forget the woman they had robbed, because the most dangerous predator is the one the prey no longer remembers exists. By the time the IV bag was empty and Yvette was carefully removing the needle from my port, my laptop was closed, safely tucked away in my bag, carrying the digital seeds of their future destruction. Walking out of the hospital that afternoon, the crisp air hitting my face, my body exhausted but my spirit vibrating with a dangerous, suppressed power, my phone buzzed one last time with a text from my mother that read, "Hope the appointment went well. We are so busy with wedding prep. Probably won't be able to check in much this week. Love you." I didn't reply. I simply slid the phone into my pocket, walked to my car, and drove away from the hospital, stepping firmly into the shadows where a matriarch is not born through love, but forged through fire, betrayal, and the patient, silent calculation of absolute ruin. The silence of my apartment when I returned from that first chemo session was no longer a symbol of my isolation. It was the canvas upon which I was about to paint my empire. I didn't wait for my mother to return from her Bahamian triumph to officially cut ties, because dramatic confrontations were for women who still hoped to be understood, and I was entirely done hoping. The very next morning, fighting a wave of chemically induced nausea that made the room spin, I contacted my landlord, paid the penalty to break my lease using the last of a small emergency credit line I had kept hidden from my family, and hired a crew of silent, efficient movers. I supervised them from a chair in the corner as they packed my life into boxes, my body aching with a profound, bone-deep weariness, but my mind operating with the sharp, crystalline focus of a sniper finding their mark. I rented a loft in an industrial building on the edge of the city, a space with exposed brick, heavy steel doors, and most importantly, a state-of-the-art security system that no unauthorized spare key could ever breach. Before the week was out, before Felicity even had the chance to walk down the aisle in her custom gown funded by my blood, I had completely vanished from the physical coordinates my family knew, changing my phone number, closing my email accounts, and leaving absolutely no forwarding address. I didn't leave a dramatic letter explaining my departure, because the matriarch's true power lies in the withdrawal of her presence, in the sudden, shocking vacuum created when the foundation they built their chaotic lives upon is quietly removed in the middle of the night. For the first few months, the physical toll of the chemotherapy was a brutal, relentless assault on my biology, stripping away my hair, my energy, and the soft, forgiving curves of my face, leaving behind a sharp, hollowed-out geometry of pure survival. I bought a collection of flawlessly crafted silk scarves to wrap around my bald head, treating them not as a concealment of my illness, but as the regal crown of a woman walking through the fire and refusing to burn. During those long, agonizing nights when the metallic taste of the poison made it impossible to sleep, and my joints felt like they were packed with crushed glass, I didn't cry for my mother's touch. Instead, I sat up in my new sterile bed, opened my laptop, and began laying the digital bricks of Vanguard Digital Strategy. I transitioned from merely editing promotional videos to analyzing the metadata behind them, teaching myself advanced digital forensics, cybersecurity auditing, and financial data tracking, transforming my existing skill set into a weaponized form of corporate intelligence. I reached out to former clients, offering deep dive audits into their digital infrastructure, exposing vulnerabilities, identifying embezzlements, and streamlining their data security with a cold, ruthless efficiency that quickly earned me a reputation as a ghost in the machine who could see the financial truths they were trying to hide. My first major contract came from a mid-sized tech firm in Seattle that suspected their CFO of siphoning funds, and within 72 hours of gaining access to their servers, I handed them a meticulously documented dossier that proved the fraud, earning a consulting fee that instantly replaced the $15,000 my family had stolen, and then doubled it. The money started flowing in, quiet and substantial, transferring into secure, heavily encrypted accounts that bore only my name, while my body simultaneously fought its way back from the brink of death, the tumors shrinking under the chemical bombardment just as my bank balances swelled. I spent my days receiving infusions under the watchful, proud eye of Nurse Yvette, who had become the closest thing to a confidant I allowed myself to have, and my nights decrypting financial ledgers, tracking offshore holding companies, and studying the intricate architecture of modern financial fraud. I became obsessed with the mechanics of the lie, specifically the kind of lies men like Greg told to project wealth, learning how to spot the invisible seams in their digital personas, the hollow shell companies, the leveraged debts, and the desperate shuffling of funds that always preceded a catastrophic collapse. My family's absence during this grueling metamorphosis was a profound blessing, a total sensory deprivation from their constant, draining demands, allowing me to channel every ounce of my life force into my own resurrection, rather than pouring it into their bottomless pit of need. It took them 3 months to even realize I was truly gone. The realization didn't come because they missed my laugh or worried about my health. It came because the holidays were approaching, and Beverly needed someone to organize the catering, clean the ancestral home, and absorb the stress of her hosting duties. When her text messages to my old number bounced back and her emails returned as undeliverable, I imagined her initial annoyance quickly curdling into an insulted fury, likely spinning a narrative to her friends that I was throwing a selfish, prolonged tantrum over the wedding money. I occasionally monitored their public social media profiles using ghost accounts, observing the curated, heavily filtered illusion of their perfect lives. Felicity posing in designer clothes she couldn't afford, Beverly hosting luncheons in the family mansion she used as a symbol of her generational status, and Greg posting cryptic, aggressive motivational quotes about grinding and disrupting the market, the universal mating call of the modern con artist. They looked so incredibly smug, so completely secure in their false superiority, entirely unaware that the woman they had left to die in a cramped apartment had not only survived, but had evolved into an apex predator swimming silently in the deep waters directly beneath their fragile, leaky boat. By the time I reached the end of my chemotherapy regimen, exactly 8 months after that horrific morning in my old living room, the doctor declared me in full remission, handing me my life back with a warm smile that I returned with a polite, measured nod. I walked out of the oncology center on that final day, the afternoon sun warming my face, my new hair growing in as a soft, tight, silver-flecked crown, wearing a sharply tailored, perfectly pressed gray suit that felt less like clothing and more like a suit of armor. I didn't throw a party. I didn't post a triumphant survivor selfie. I simply got into the sleek, black luxury sedan I had purchased in cash, drove to my high-rise office overlooking the city skyline, and officially signed the incorporation papers that elevated Vanguard Digital Strategy from a freelance consulting operation into a full-fledged, multi-million-dollar corporate intelligence firm. The old Hazel, the exhausted, people-pleasing backbone of a toxic family, was cremated in the fires of the chemotherapy, and the woman who emerged from the ashes was cold, brilliant, and entirely untouchable. A matriarch not of an ungrateful family, but of her own vast, rapidly expanding empire. Over the next 2 years, I expanded my team, hiring former forensic accountants, retired cybercrime detectives, and brilliant data analysts, building a formidable agency that specialized in dismantling corporate facades, quietly taking down fraudulent CEOs, and recovering stolen assets for elite clients. I moved in circles of genuine wealth and power, dining with executives who respected my terrifying intellect and my complete lack of emotional compromise. My reputation built on the fact that when Vanguard Digital Strategy turned its eye onto a company, no secret remained buried. Yet, despite the massive influx of wealth, the designer wardrobe, and the expansive penthouse I now called home, I never lost the cold, hardened core of my original purpose, keeping one specialized, highly classified file open on my personal encrypted server, a file simply labeled Apex Horizon. While I was building an empire on truth, Greg was desperately trying to sustain an empire built on thin air. And through my automated data crawlers, I watched his financial house of cards begin to violently sway in the digital wind. I tracked his frantic movements across the blockchain, the mounting debts, the angry investors in obscure forums, and the desperate, high-interest loans he was quietly securing against non-existent collateral, his arrogance blinding him to the fact that his every digital breath was being monitored by the sister-in-law he thought he had destroyed. The beauty of my vengeance was its absolute patience. I didn't want to simply expose him. I wanted to wait until he was so deeply buried in his own fraud that in his desperation to survive, he would inevitably drag my parents down into the mud with him. I knew my mother's psychology intimately. I knew that her pathological need to maintain the appearance of high society and her blind worship of Felicity's marriage would override any basic financial logic she possessed, making her the perfect, willing victim to Greg's inevitable demands for a bailout. So I waited, cultivating my garden of power, meditating in the profound, unbroken silence of my beautiful, empty penthouse, sipping premium green tea in the early mornings, watching the city wake up, and knowing with absolute, terrifying certainty that the moment they finally crossed the point of no return was rapidly approaching. I was no longer the bleeding heart they could manipulate. I was the architect of their impending silence, the silent partner in their destruction, holding the power to not just break them, but to erase their legacy entirely. And as my data algorithms flagged a massive, highly irregular query on the title deed of my parents' generational mansion, a slow, dangerous smile finally graced my lips. The digital alert that flashed across the ultra-wide curved monitor in my home office did not emit a loud, dramatic siren. It was simply a subtle, pulsing amber light, indicating a definitive match on a high-priority financial watch list I had quietly established 3 years ago when I first built the architecture of Vanguard Digital Strategy. 3 years is a fascinating, terrifying measure of time. Long enough for a woman's body to completely purge the toxic, metallic residue of chemotherapy and rebuild her cellular structure into something entirely unbreakable. And just long enough for an arrogant, reckless man to completely burn through a massive, fraudulent illusion of unlimited wealth. My company was now operating out of the top 2 floors of a pristine downtown high-rise, employing over 40 of the sharpest forensic accountants, cybersecurity auditors, and data intelligence minds in the country. But this specific file, the one meticulously documenting the financial decay of my own bloodline, was something I handled exclusively on my private, heavily encrypted servers. The alert originated from a county clerk's digital database in the affluent, historic district where my parents resided, signaling that a comprehensive title search had been officially executed on the deed of the ancestral mansion, a sprawling, colonial-style property that had been the absolute crown jewel of my mother Beverly's entire social identity for 4 decades. My mother had always treated that magnificent house not as a nurturing home for her family, but as an opulent stage, a meticulously curated museum of generational African-American excellence, where she hosted her elite bridge clubs, church leadership committees, and high society galas, constantly using the pristine mahogany floors and imported crystal chandeliers to project an intimidating image of unshakable financial stability and moral superiority. To see a commercial title search initiated against that specific property meant that her beloved stability was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, sweating, undignified need for immediate liquidity. And sitting in the profound quiet of my penthouse, I knew exactly who was driving that desperation. I calmly set down my cup of premium matcha tea, my hands steady and adorned with a heavy, custom-made gold monogram ring that served as a daily reminder of my own sovereignty, and pulled up the parallel tracking files I kept on Gregory T. Vance, watching the digital tapestry of my brother-in-law's life violently unravel in real time across my glowing screens. Greg's cryptocurrency venture, aggressively marketed across every social media platform as a revolutionary decentralized finance ecosystem, was revealed through my data crawlers to be nothing more than a sophisticated digital Ponzi scheme dressed up in modern Web3 tech jargon, relying entirely on a constant, frantic influx of new investors to pay off the early adopters. It was a fragile, parasitic financial structure that had completely collapsed during the recent market downturn, leaving him exposed to millions in liabilities, furious institutional investors, and pending federal inquiries that he was desperately trying to hide from his public persona. While his investors were screaming in online forums, filing class action lawsuits, and reporting him to the SEC, my younger sister Felicity was still oblivious, busy maintaining her delusional, high society aesthetic on Instagram, posting heavily filtered photos from leased yachts in Miami, and wearing high-fashion designer garments that I knew, from tracking their joint credit utilization ratios, were maxing out every single credit card they possessed. Felicity had been meticulously raised by my mother to be a decorative ornament, a beautiful, helpless creature who was never taught the actual value of a hard-earned dollar or the concept of consequence, only the value of projecting a flawless image. And Greg had played the role of her wealthy, untouchable savior flawlessly, until the offshore money finally ran out. Now, facing imminent ruin and the terrifying prospect of going to federal prison, Greg had inevitably turned to the one person whose pride was even greater and more easily manipulated than his own, Beverly. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, visualizing the exact scenario playing out in my mother's immaculate formal living room. Picturing Greg sitting on the antique velvet sofa, sweating through his tailored suit, using his smooth, charismatic sales pitch to explain that his funds were merely temporarily frozen by overzealous regulators, expertly framing himself as a brilliant visionary being unfairly persecuted by the system. He would have played directly and ruthlessly on my mother's deepest, most paralyzing fear, social humiliation, convincing her that if his company went under, the resulting media scandal would ruin the family name forever, taking Felicity's lavish lifestyle and Beverly's immaculate, carefully guarded reputation down into the mud with it. 3 years ago, my mother had coldly rationalized stealing a dying woman's $15,000 lifeline because she believed Greg was an undeniable investment in their status. Now, to protect that rapidly failing investment, she was incredibly willing to mortgage the very roof over her head, sacrificing her own sanctuary on the altar of her son-in-law's ego. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I deployed a series of automated penetration scripts, easily bypassing the rudimentary security protocols of the subprime financial institutions Greg was actively courting, discovering that traditional, reputable banks had already flatly denied their applications. The standard algorithms had easily detected Greg's toxic debt-to-income ratio, the pending litigation flags on his Social Security number, and the depressing reality of my father Reginald's completely dwindled retirement accounts, leaving them with no legitimate avenues for capital. Instead, the data showed they had turned in their panic to a shadow lender, a notoriously aggressive predatory equity firm based in Delaware, known as Obsidian Capital Partners, an institution famous in my industry for issuing massive, high-interest bridge loans against prime real estate with draconian, unforgiving default clauses designed specifically to seize assets from desperate people. The digital paperwork I covertly extracted from a poorly secured email server revealed the staggering, breathtaking truth of their stupidity. Beverly and Reginald had co-signed a catastrophic $300,000 loan, using the unencumbered mansion as the sole collateral, with the funds wired directly into an offshore holding account controlled entirely by Greg's failing LLC. My father, a man who had spent his entire adult life quietly enabling my mother's narcissism and retreating into the background to avoid her wrath, had signed away his family's generational legacy with a simple stroke of a pen, likely believing Beverly's fierce assurances that Greg would easily pay it back with interest within the month once his crypto tokens unfroze. But my forensic tracking algorithms, which monitored the blockchain and traditional banking nodes simultaneously, showed exactly where that money went within 48 hours of clearing the wire. 60% was instantly swallowed by Greg's oldest, most aggressive creditors, who were threatening physical violence. 20% went immediately to securing a high-powered defense attorney specializing in white-collar fraud. And the remaining 20% was rapidly bleeding out to sustain Felicity's manic shopping habits, a desperate, pathetic attempt to keep up appearances while the ship was actively taking on water. I sat in the profound silence of my office, feeling a chilling, absolute absence of sympathy, analyzing the data without a single fluctuation in my heart rate, reflecting on how the woman I used to be, the exhausted, bleeding backbone of the family, might have picked up the phone, driven by a toxic, ingrained sense of duty to warn them. The old Hazel would have tried to save them from their own catastrophic stupidity, begging them to see the truth about the man they had chosen over her, absorbing their insults while desperately trying to pull them back from the edge of the cliff. But Vanguard Digital strategy was not built on mercy, forgiveness, or familial obligation. It was built purely on data, logic, and consequence. And the data clearly indicated that the patient was entirely terminal by their own hand, making any intervention not only useless, but an insult to my own peace. The quiet, unassailable luxury of my penthouse, the soft, melancholy jazz playing from the hidden surround sound speakers, The abstract original modern art hanging on the pristine white walls, the sweeping, unobstructed view of the Seattle skyline glittering against the night sky, stood in stark, beautiful contrast to the chaotic, sweaty, terrifying panic I knew was currently suffocating my childhood home. I had spent my entire youth and the majority of my adult life being the emotional shock absorber for their crises, the invisible, unappreciated daughter who quietly cleaned up the financial and emotional messes so the golden child could continue to shine without interruption. But now, I was the silent storm they didn't even know was gathering on their horizon. I meticulously reviewed the specific terms of the Obsidian Capital loan, my eyes scanning the fine print on the digital document with the predatory precision of a hawk locking onto its prey, noting that the interest rate was completely exorbitant, structured with massive balloon payments they could never realistically meet without Greg producing an absolute financial miracle. The default clause buried on page 42 was beautifully ruthless. Exactly 90 days of non-payment granted the lender immediate, uncontested rights to bypass standard mediation, initiate aggressive foreclosure proceedings, and seize the physical asset without requiring a lengthy court battle. According to the payment ledger I had just breached, they had already missed the first agonizing payment. The second payment was due in exactly 5 days, and a quick sweep of their liquid cash reserves across all known checking and savings accounts totaled less than $4,000, meaning the collapse was not just possible, it was mathematically imminent. The grand illusion of their wealth was finally cracking, the polished veneer peeling away to reveal the terrified, hollow, bankrupt reality underneath. And the immense stress was undoubtedly beginning to fracture their relationships, turning their once proud home into a pressure cooker of resentment and fear. I could almost perfectly hear the hushed, tense arguments echoing in the grand hallways of the mansion, Beverly finally questioning Greg's genius as the collection calls began, Felicity throwing hysterical tantrums over her suddenly declined platinum credit cards, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of a family that had built their entire foundation on lies, finally feeling the earth violently shift beneath their feet. I did not want to simply sit back and watch them lose the house to a random, faceless, predatory lender in Delaware. I wanted to be the architect of their eviction, to legally hold the deed to their pride in my own hands, to look them directly in the eye when the final, devastating bill for my stolen life came due. I calmly picked up my secure, encrypted smartphone and dialed the direct line to my lead acquisitions director, a brilliant, morally flexible, and impeccably dressed former investment banker named Julian, whom I paid exceptionally well to execute my most aggressive, complex financial maneuvers without ever asking personal questions. "Julian," I said, my voice smooth, cold, and echoing slightly in the vastness of my pristine office, entirely devoid of the trembling weakness they remembered. "I need you to set up a blind trust immediately, completely disconnected from Vanguard's primary corporate structure, layered through at least 3 international holding companies to ensure absolute, impenetrable anonymity." "Consider it done, Hazel," Julian replied instantly, the sound of his mechanical keyboard clicking rapidly, echoing over the line as he immediately began the process. "What is the specific target for this vehicle?" "Obsidian Capital Partners holds a highly distressed subprime mortgage on a residential property in the Baldwin Hills Historic District," I instructed, securely transmitting the parcel number, the debtor names, and the loan identification details through our encrypted channel directly to his terminal. "The debtors are about to hit their critical 90-day default window, and given Obsidian's business model, they will be looking to quietly offload the bad paper at a discount to avoid a messy, localized foreclosure battle. I want that debt, Julian. Buy it out entirely, pay a premium above market value if you have to secure it quickly, but obtain the exclusive rights to that mortgage and ensure the immediate, quiet transfer of the lien directly to our new blind trust by the end of the week." "A distressed residential asset? That's significantly outside our usual corporate acquisition strategy, Hazel," Julian noted mildly, though his tone remained entirely professional, never actually questioning my ultimate directives because he knew my instincts were flawless. "It is highly personal," I replied quietly, the immense weight of those 3 words carrying 3 years of silent, calculated patience, the memory of cold hospital rooms, and the phantom ache of a chemo port they never once asked about. Secure the paper, Julian, and the moment the transfer is complete, prepare the official legal notice of default for my personal review. I ended the call without waiting for a goodbye, stood up from my desk, and walked slowly over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the glittering, endless lights of the city below, feeling a profound sense of alignment in my soul. The heavy, crushing exhaustion that had defined my entire existence before the cancer, the quiet, pathetic desperation of a loyal daughter constantly begging to be seen and valued, was completely, permanently eradicated, replaced by the cool, immaculate grace of a matriarch who had finally claimed her rightful throne in the ashes of their disrespect. My family had arrogantly sacrificed me at the altar of their vanity, assuming I would quietly fade away into the background and die without inconveniencing their schedules. But they were about to discover, in the most devastating way possible, that the woman they threw into the flames had learned exactly how to control the fire, and I was patiently, elegantly bringing the inferno directly to their front door. 72 hours after my brief conversation with Julian, the encrypted file containing the finalized establishment of the blind trust appeared in my secure inbox, bearing the elegantly simple corporate title of Aegis Sentinel Holdings, a name chosen specifically because an aegis is a mythological shield, and I was finally raising mine, not to protect my family, but to permanently guard myself against them. The speed at which Julian operated was a testament to the immense liquid wealth Vanguard Digital Strategy had generated over the past 3 years, allowing us to bypass the bureaucratic delays that plagued normal financial acquisitions and plunge directly into the dark, unregulated waters of predatory debt trading. While Julian ruthlessly negotiated the buyout with Obsidian Capital Partners in Delaware, leveraging our massive capital reserves to force them to surrender the distressed mortgage paper, I submerged myself entirely into the forensic autopsy of Gregory T. Vance's digital existence, determined to map every single compromised artery of his fraudulent empire before I finally pulled the plug. I sat in the absolute climate-controlled silence of my penthouse, the massive curved monitors casting a cold blue glow across my face as I executed a series of advanced blockchain tracing algorithms, methodically unwinding the chaotic, desperate transactions of Greg's heavily promoted crypto token, which he had obnoxiously named AuraCoin. The digital architecture of AuraCoin was not a revolutionary decentralized finance ecosystem, as he had aggressively pitched to his naive investors and my gullible mother. It was a clumsily constructed ERC20 token built on copied code, existing entirely as a shell to siphon Ethereum deposits directly into a series of offshore wallets located in the Cayman Islands. It was a classic, textbook rug pull operation, but Greg was too arrogant and fundamentally undisciplined to actually execute the exit strategy correctly, choosing instead to treat the investor liquidity pool as his personal, unlimited ATM to fund the extravagant, high society lifestyle my sister Felicity relentlessly demanded to maintain her carefully curated social media presence. My eyes tracked the digital ledger, watching the massive influx of capital from desperate, trusting retail investors slowly drain away to pay for luxury yacht charters in Biscayne Bay, heavily leased exotic sports cars, custom designer wardrobes, and the exorbitant, eye-watering monthly maintenance fees of the exclusive country club Beverly had pressured them to join to elevate the family's social standing. The sheer, breathtaking entitlement of it all was sickening, but the true, devastating blow to whatever lingering, microscopic shred of familial attachment I possessed came when I ran a targeted historical search algorithm specifically designed to track the exact $15,000 wire transfer my mother had initiated from my emergency medical account on the eve of my first chemotherapy session 3 years ago. I watched the data compile on my screen, tracing the routing numbers from my drained bank account to Greg's Commercial Holding LLC, waiting to see the invoice for the premium Miami drone videography team they had so ruthlessly claimed was worth more than my survival. The algorithm finished its calculation, projecting the final destination of those specific funds, and the absolute, chilling truth of my family's betrayal settled into the room like a heavy winter frost. The $15,000 had never gone to a videographer, a wedding planner, or any vendor associated with Felicity's Bahamian fairy tale. The exact sum had been immediately routed to a high-risk, private collection agency operating out of Las Vegas to settle a massive, overdue sports gambling debt Greg had accrued months before the wedding, a debt that had resulted in aggressive, threatening phone calls to his personal cell phone. My mother, in her blind, desperate obsession to secure this fraudulent crypto millionaire as her son-in-law, had not just sacrificed my life for my sister's vanity, she had literally stolen my cancer treatment funds to pay off a degenerate gambler's bookie so the wedding wouldn't be violently interrupted by loan sharks. I stared at the screen for a very long time, my face perfectly still, my heartbeat steady and calm, feeling the final, heavy iron door slam shut on any possibility of grace, forgiveness, or reconciliation. The old Hazel might have wept at the profound cheapness of her own existence in their eyes, mourning the reality that her flesh and blood had traded her literal survival for a gambling debt. But the woman sitting in the penthouse merely saved the forensic documentation to a secure flash drive, meticulously building the ultimate, undeniable weapon of their destruction. They had viewed my life as entirely expendable, a minor, easily justified sacrifice to protect their fragile illusion of status. And in doing so, they had unwittingly created the absolute architect of their impending ruin. My phone buzzed on the mahogany desk, a secure message from Julian confirming that Obsidian Capital, facing the threat of a massive federal audit that Vanguard could easily trigger through our government contacts, had completely caved, eagerly selling the distressed Baldwin Hills mortgage paper to Aegis Sentinel Holdings at a slight premium just to wash their hands of the toxic asset. The electronic transfer of the deed, the original promissory notes, and the full legal rights of foreclosure were currently being heavily encrypted and transmitted to my private server, meaning that as of 2:14 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I officially, legally, owned the roof over my parents' heads. 2 days later, the physical manifestation of that power arrived at Vanguard's corporate headquarters via armed courier, a thick, heavy manila envelope containing the notarized hard copy documents of the mortgage transfer, which I instructed my executive assistant to place directly on the center of my desk. I locked the frosted glass doors of my office, walked over to the desk, and slowly opened the envelope, sliding the crisp, legal-sized papers out onto the polished wood, my eyes scanning the signatures of Beverly and Reginald Vance at the bottom of the original loan agreement. The ink was slightly faded, but the desperate, cowardly reality of my father's signature, a man who had spent his entire life avoiding conflict, silently watching my mother emotionally cannibalize me, and finally signing away his own legacy just to keep the peace, filled me with a cold, hollow disgust. I touched the raised seal on the deed transfer, feeling the immense, intoxicating gravity of the moment. This piece of paper was not just a legal document. It was the ultimate, irrefutable shift in the power dynamic of my entire bloodline. For 33 years, they had held the emotional and financial leverage, demanding my servitude, mocking my independence, and discarding me when I became inconvenient. But now, the scales had violently and silently tipped, and I held the absolute power to render them homeless with a single phone call to the county sheriff. I did not want to simply evict them quietly through the mail. I wanted them to experience the sheer, suffocating terror of losing everything, to exhaust every single avenue of salvation, and to finally, inevitably, crawl back to the daughter they had left for dead, begging for the very mercy they had so callously denied her. I opened my laptop and instructed Julian to initiate the first phase of the psychological warfare, an automated, legally binding notice of debt acquisition sent via certified mail and email from Aegis Sentinel Holdings to my parents and Greg, informing them that their loan had been sold, that they were critically past due on their balloon payments, and that standard mediation was being aggressively bypassed in favor of immediate asset seizure. I knew exactly how the chain reaction would play out in that sprawling, quiet mansion when the letter arrived. Beverly would initially fly into a panicked, defensive rage, demanding that Greg fix the situation, only to finally realize that her golden son-in-law was completely bankrupt, his phone likely disconnected, his corporate offices abandoned, leaving her and my father completely exposed to the unforgiving machinery of corporate foreclosure. Over the next 2 weeks, I monitored their frantic digital activity, watching my mother systematically drain her last remaining meager savings accounts in a desperate, pathetic attempt to hire a defense attorney to fight the blind trust, only to be repeatedly informed that the obsidian contract she signed was absolutely ironclad and legally bulletproof. She reached out to her wealthy church friends, the same women she had hosted for decades in that very house, attempting to secure emergency loans. But my data algorithms showed those requests being swiftly and politely denied, as the high society circles she worshipped operated on a strict, ruthless economy of status, and the stench of Greg's impending federal indictment was already spreading like a virus. They were drowning, isolated, and completely terrified, the pristine walls of their beloved mansion slowly closing in on them as the 30-day foreclosure countdown ticked away with absolute mechanical indifference. It was on the 14th day of their financial suffocation, while I was sitting in a high-level corporate intelligence briefing with my senior partners regarding a completely unrelated tech merger, that my specialized burner phone, the only device that carried a trace to my old, abandoned life, kept active specifically for this exact moment, began to vibrate violently against my leg. I calmly excused myself from the glass-walled conference room, walking out onto the private terrace overlooking the city, the cold wind whipping the edge of my immaculate gray blazer, and pulled the device from my pocket, looking at the glowing screen. The caller ID was unregistered, but the barrage of frantic, rapid-fire text messages lighting up the display were unmistakably written in the panicked, demanding syntax of Beverly Vance, a woman who had finally run out of victims and was desperately trying to summon the one person she believed would always absorb her failures. "Hazel, it's your mother. We are in a catastrophic emergency. Greg's assets have been temporarily frozen by a terrible misunderstanding, and a predatory equity firm is trying to steal the family home. We need you to contact us immediately. This is about family legacy. You must have some savings left. Call me the second you get this. We are running out of time." I stared at the glowing words, the sheer, staggering audacity of her demand, reaching out to the daughter she had robbed and abandoned to die 3 years ago, casually demanding financial salvation as if the past had never happened, washing over me like a wave of pure, unfiltered psychological validation. She didn't ask if I was alive. She didn't ask if the cancer had returned. She didn't apologize for the theft. She simply reverted to her default programming, assuming that the strong, reliable Hazel would instantly drop everything, empty her bank accounts, and rush to the rescue to protect Felicity's comfort and Beverly's pride. I did not reply to the text messages, nor did I block the number. Instead, I simply locked the screen, slid the phone back into my pocket, and stood on the terrace looking out at the horizon, a slow, dangerous, and perfectly serene smile spreading across my face. I was not going to save them, nor was I going to ignore them. I was going to let the pressure build until the very oxygen in their lungs felt like glass, until their desperation broke through every layer of their narcissism. And then, only then, would I allow them to summon me, stepping back into their lives not as a victim, but as the executioner holding the final, devastating bill. For the next 48 hours, I let the burner phone sit on the edge of my mahogany desk like a dormant explosive, its screen occasionally lighting up with increasingly unhinged missives from a mother who was rapidly realizing that her favorite currency, guilt, was no longer accepted in my economy. I watched her texts devolve from authoritative commands to frantic, veiled threats, and finally into pathetic, manipulative attempts at maternal warmth, using phrases like, "We are so worried about your health," and "Please come home so we can care for you." Lies so transparent and grotesque, they almost made me laugh out loud in the sterile silence of my office. Through the forensic data streams feeding directly into my private server, I was granted a godlike perspective over their physical and financial deterioration. Watching as Felicity's platinum credit cards were violently declined at luxury boutiques in Beverly Hills, forcing her to abandon carts full of designer clothes while the cashiers offered those deeply humiliating, sympathetic smiles reserved for the newly poor. I tracked Greg's digital footprint as he desperately tried to liquidate his remaining, heavily depreciated crypto assets, only to find that the federal authorities had finally frozen his primary exchange accounts, leaving him virtually penniless and completely trapped within the walls of my parents' mansion, undoubtedly subjected to Beverly's escalating, venomous rage as the illusion of his genius shattered. The sheer poetic justice of their confinement was exquisite. The sprawling colonial estate that my mother had worshipped above her own flesh and blood had now become a luxurious prison, a gilded cage where three narcissists were locked together, slowly cannibalizing each other's egos as the 30-day foreclosure clock ticked down to zero. I did not intervene, I did not block their numbers, and I certainly did not reply. I simply let them drown in the terrifying, unfamiliar waters of absolute consequence, knowing that the silence of an abandoned daughter is the most deafening sound a toxic parent can ever hear when they finally need something they cannot steal. By the beginning of the third week, the automated systems of Aegis Sentinel Holdings dispatched the final, legally mandatory 7-day notice of default and impending physical eviction, a document printed on heavy, unforgiving legal stock that explicitly stated the property would be seized and all occupants forcibly removed by county sheriffs if the full balance of $300,000, plus exorbitant predatory interest, was not immediately remitted. The arrival of that letter must have triggered an absolute nuclear meltdown in the Vance household, because mere hours after the courier logged the delivery confirmation, my burner phone began ringing continuously, the harsh electronic chime echoing off the glass walls of my penthouse. I ignored the calls, letting them drop to a voicemail inbox that I had intentionally left full, forcing Beverly to resort to text messages that grew increasingly frantic, demanding, and utterly detached from the reality of our estranged relationship. "Hazel, this is not a game. You are acting like a petulant child while your family's entire legacy is being stolen by criminals," she wrote, her thumbs clearly flying across her screen in a blind panic, completely ignoring the fact that the only criminals in this scenario were the son-in-law currently hiding in her guest bedroom and the mother who had funded his gambling addiction with my chemotherapy money. When insults failed to provoke a response, she pivoted seamlessly back to delusion, attempting to command me as if I were still the exhausted, obedient 20-something living under her roof. "I know you have money squirreled away from your little video business. You always were a hoarder. We are coming to Seattle. Greg found an IP trace on one of your old web domains. We are having a family meeting this Friday at the Sovereign Room downtown. You will be there at 7 p.m. Bring a certified cashier's check for $300,000, and we are willing to overlook this ridiculous 3-year tantrum of yours and welcome you back into the fold." I stared at the glowing screen, marveling at the sheer, breathtaking audacity of a woman who was literally hours away from homelessness, yet still believed she possessed the authority to summon me to a luxury steakhouse and demand a 6-figure ransom as the price of her entirely worthless forgiveness. She actually believed she was offering me a gift, the privilege of buying my way back into my role as their emotional pack mule, because in her distorted, narcissistic worldview, the highest honor I could ever achieve was being useful to Felicity and maintaining the family's public facade. The Sovereign Room was a notoriously exclusive, obscenely expensive restaurant favored by the city's tech elite and old money, a place where the waiters wore white gloves and the cheapest bottle of wine cost more than my first car, proving that even at the absolute edge of the abyss, Beverly Vance would rather burn her last dollar projecting an image of immense wealth than admit defeat in a modest coffee shop. She was banking on the environment intimidating me, assuming I would show up in my old, worn-out sweaters, overwhelmed by the opulence and easily bullied into signing over my life savings just to avoid a public scene, completely unaware that I was a regular at the Sovereign Room, that the maitre d' knew me by my first name, and that I had finalized 2 major corporate acquisitions at the very corner booth she had likely reserved. I did not reply to her text to confirm my attendance, choosing instead to let her sit in agonizing, sweating uncertainty for the next 48 hours, wondering if her sacrificial lamb would actually show up to the slaughter. I spent the remainder of the week meticulously preparing the execution documents, directing Julian to draft the final, irrevocable transfer of the property deed into my personal name, ready to be filed the moment the 7-day notice expired, and assembling a comprehensive, beautifully bound portfolio containing every piece of forensic evidence Vanguard had gathered on Greg's massive fraud, my mother's illegal wire transfer, and the predatory loan they had so foolishly signed. This portfolio was not designed to argue with them. It was designed to be the immovable, undeniable tombstone of their lies, a physical manifestation of the absolute power I now held over their existence. On Friday evening, as the autumn sun dipped below the Seattle skyline and painted the city in shades of cold, bruised purple, I stood before the full-length mirror in my master dressing room, the soft lighting illuminating a woman who bore absolutely no resemblance to the terrified, broken girl who had sat on that cheap sofa 3 years ago. The cancer had stripped away my physical softness, but the fire of my resurrection had forged something breathtakingly sharp and unyielding in its place. I was 43 years old, my natural hair worn in a short, immaculately edged, silver-flecked cut that framed a face devoid of apology or fear. I bypassed the colorful, vibrant silk dresses in my closet, reaching instead for a custom-tailored, dark charcoal gray suit crafted from Italian wool, the fabric falling perfectly over my frame, the razor-sharp lapels serving as a subtle warning that the woman wearing it was completely armored and ready for war. I paired it with a crisp, high-collared white silk blouse, buttoned to the collarbone to conceal the faint, jagged scar where my chemo port used to be, a physical reminder of the poison I had survived and the poison I was about to excise from my life permanently. I slipped on a pair of classic black leather stiletto pumps, the kind that made a sharp, authoritative sound against hardwood floors, and selected only 2 pieces of jewelry, a pair of simple diamond stud earrings and the heavy gold monogram ring I wore on my right index finger, a symbol of the empire I had built entirely alone in the dark. I placed the meticulously organized portfolio into a sleek black leather structured tote bag, alongside a brand new, flawlessly polished Mont Blanc fountain pen, its heavy, cool metal completely steady in my grip, anticipating the moment I would slide it across the table to secure their final surrender. I did not feel a trace of anxiety, anger, or the familiar suffocating panic that used to accompany any interaction with my mother. My heart rate was a steady, rhythmic 60 beats per minute, my mind as clear and cold as a frozen lake, perfectly aligned with the terrifying, quiet grace of a matriarch who has absolutely nothing left to lose and an entire world to take. When my private driver pulled the black luxury SUV up to the valet stand outside the Sovereign Room, the heavy oak doors of the restaurant swinging open to reveal the warm golden glow of the opulent dining room, I did not rush out of the vehicle. I simply sat in the quiet luxury of the leather back seat for a single luxurious minute, breathing in the scent of my expensive perfume and savoring the final seconds of their ignorance. Inside that restaurant, my mother, my sister, and the fraud who had ruined them were sitting around a table adorned with crystal and silver, likely sipping sparkling water they could not afford, sweating under their expensive clothes, glancing nervously at the door, still clinging to the desperate, pathetic hope that the weak, malleable Hazel of the past would walk through it with her head bowed and a checkbook in her trembling hands. They were expecting a victim, a bleeding heart they could manipulate with a few sharp words and a false promise of familial inclusion. But they had fundamentally miscalculated the terrifying alchemy of trauma and time. They had pushed me into the grave, but they forgot to make sure I was dead, and now the ghost of their discarded daughter was walking into the light, clothed in absolute sovereignty, holding the deed to their pride, and fully prepared to watch their empire burn to ash before the appetizers even arrived. I stepped out of the vehicle, the crisp evening air bracing against my face, gave a polite, measured nod to the valet who instantly recognized me, and walked smoothly toward the entrance, the soft, rhythmic click of my heels echoing on the pavement like the ticking of a doomsday clock, stepping over the threshold into the opulent warmth of the restaurant, completely ready to serve them the coldest dish of reality they had ever tasted. The heavy oak doors of the sovereign room closed behind me, instantly silencing the ambient noise of the Seattle traffic and replacing it with the low, sophisticated hum of clinking crystal, the murmured, high-stakes conversations of the city's financial elite, and the soft, melancholic notes of a grand piano playing in the dimly lit corner of the opulent dining room. The air smelled of expensive, aged steak, rich truffle oil, and the subtle, metallic scent of concentrated wealth, an environment designed specifically to intimidate the uninitiated, which was precisely why my mother had chosen it for her grand ambush. As I stepped onto the plush crimson carpet, the lead maitre d', a meticulously groomed Frenchman named Antoine, who had personally overseen dozens of my corporate acquisition dinners over the past 2 years, immediately abandoned his post at the front desk and glided toward me with a genuine, welcoming smile. "Good evening, Ms. Vance," Antoine murmured softly, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of profound professional respect that I had earned not through demands, but through exorbitant tipping and flawless etiquette. "It is an absolute pleasure to see you tonight. Shall I prepare your usual private dining suite, or are you joining the board members from the tech merger in the main hall?" I offered Antoine a small, composed smile, my voice remaining entirely level and devoid of any of the anxiety that used to choke me in these high society spaces. "Neither tonight, Antoine," I replied quietly. "I believe there is a reservation under the name Beverly Vance. I will be joining their table." Antoine's impeccably managed expression faltered for just a fraction of a second, his trained eyes briefly darting toward a secluded, shadowy corner booth near the back of the restaurant, before returning to my face with a look of subtle, professional concern. "Ah, yes, the Vance party. They arrived nearly 45 minutes ago. Right this way, Ms. Vance." He turned and began navigating through the maze of white-clothed tables, and instead of following directly on his heels, I deliberately hung back a few paces, using the distance to quietly observe the table from afar before they noticed my approach. Through the flickering light of the table candles, I saw them sitting in the curved leather booth, and the visual reality of their absolute deterioration was far more pathetic than the digital data could have ever conveyed. My mother, Beverly, was sitting rigidly upright, wearing a vintage Chanel suit that had once been her signature armor, but in the harsh, unforgiving light of her current desperation, the fabric looked tired, the fit slightly too loose around her shoulders, revealing the physical toll of the immense stress she was carrying. Her neck was tight with tension, her jaw permanently clenched as her eyes darted nervously around the room, assessing the wealthy patrons with the frantic, calculating gaze of a woman who realizes she no longer belongs in the club she spent her entire life trying to rule. Next to her sat my younger sister Felicity, aggressively scrolling through a smartphone with a visibly cracked screen protector, her previously flawless, heavily financed Miami bride aesthetic completely shattered by the reality of her declined credit cards. She was wearing a designer dress from 2 seasons ago, her posture slumped, picking at her cuticles with a nervous, manic energy, looking less like a high society wife and more like a spoiled child who had suddenly been told the carnival was permanently closed. And then there was Greg, the supposed cryptocurrency prodigy who had stolen my chemotherapy money to pay off a bookie, sitting across from them and looking like a man who was acutely aware that he was standing on a trap door with the lever about to be pulled. He was sweating through the collar of a cheap, off-the-rack dress shirt, repeatedly dabbing his forehead with a cloth napkin, continuously drinking from a complimentary glass of tap water because ordering a $20 cocktail was clearly no longer within their financial bandwidth. I stood there for a long moment, letting the heavy, cold truth of the scene wash over me, noting with an icy, clinical detachment that in the 3 years since they had abandoned me in my apartment with a newly implanted chemo port, not a single one of them had ever sent a message asking if I had survived the poison, if my hair had grown back, or if I was simply breathing. They had summoned me here tonight not as a long-lost daughter, but as a walking, breathing ATM, entirely confident that they could verbally abuse me into handing over a $300,000 check to save a mansion I was no longer allowed to call home. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the heavy, comforting weight of the gold monogram ring on my finger, and resumed my walk toward the booth, the sharp, authoritative click of my stilettos cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant. Beverly saw me first. I watched her eyes lock onto my approaching figure, and for 3 entire seconds, she completely failed to recognize her own flesh and blood. She was expecting the Hazel of the past, the exhausted, slightly overweight, deeply insecure woman, wearing practical, inexpensive clothes, her head perpetually bowed in a posture of permanent apology. Instead, she was looking at a 43-year-old self-made millionaire, clad in bespoke Italian charcoal wool, radiating an aura of cold, untouchable sovereignty. My silver-flecked hair cut into a sharp, regal crown that framed a face completely stripped of its desperate need for her approval. When the realization finally hit her, I watched the color rapidly drain from her perfectly powdered face, her mouth parting slightly in genuine, unmasked shock, a micro-expression of pure, instinctual terror flashing across her eyes, before she violently forced her features back into the familiar, haughty mask of the matriarch. Antoine pulled out the heavy leather chair across from them with a practiced flourish, and I sat down slowly, smoothing the fabric of my trousers with deliberate, agonizingly slow precision, crossing my legs and resting my hands casually on the pristine white tablecloth. The silence that descended upon the booth was absolute and suffocating, thick enough to be carved with one of the heavy silver steak knives resting beside my plate. Felicity finally looked up from her phone, her eyes widening as she took in the immaculate tailoring of my suit and the undeniable, effortless wealth radiating from my entire presence, a silent calculation running behind her eyes as she desperately tried to reconcile this version of me with the sister she had mocked 3 years ago. Greg simply stared at me with the blank, terrified expression of a cornered animal, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as he swallowed hard. "Well," Beverly finally said, her voice tight and brittle, lacking its usual resonant, commanding bass, entirely unable to hide the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for her water glass. "You certainly took your time. And what on earth have you done to your hair? You look incredibly severe, Hazel. It's hardly appropriate for a family dinner." The instinctual, immediate pivot to criticism, the classic textbook maneuver designed to instantly unbalance me and reestablish the familiar dynamic where I was the flawed, inadequate daughter seeking her validation, was so entirely predictable that I didn't even feel a flicker of annoyance. I simply looked at her, holding her gaze with a calm, unblinking intensity that I knew she had never encountered before, letting the silence stretch out, forcing her to sit in the extreme discomfort of her own transparent manipulation. "Good evening, Mother," I replied, my voice smooth, quiet, and perfectly detached, vibrating in the lower register of absolute control. "Felicity, Greg, it is fascinating to see you all exactly as I imagined you would be." Beverly's jaw tightened, clearly rattled by my refusal to take the bait regarding my appearance. She leaned forward, placing both of her hands flat on the table in an aggressive posture, dropping the pretense of a polite family reunion and immediately lunging for the lifeline. We don't have time for your cryptic, passive-aggressive remarks tonight, Hazel. We are dealing with a catastrophic emergency. A massive, illegal misunderstanding regarding Greg's corporate assets has temporarily frozen his liquidity, and some vile, predatory equity firm from Delaware is trying to exploit the situation by threatening a completely baseless foreclosure on the family home. She paused, her eyes darting to my black leather tote bag resting on the empty chair beside me. I assume you brought the cashier's check as instructed? $300,000 is a significant sum, but considering you have been living rent-free in whatever cheap apartment you've been hiding in for 3 years, I expect you've managed to hoard enough from your little freelance video business to cover it. We will, of course, draft a formal repayment schedule once Greg's legal team unfreezes his accounts. I did not reach for my bag, I did not pull out a checkbook, and I did not flinch. I merely turned my head slightly, catching the eye of the sommelier, who had been hovering a respectful distance away, instantly recognizing my subtle nod. He approached the table immediately, presenting the leather-bound wine list to me with a deep bow, entirely ignoring Greg, who was technically the man of the table, but radiated the undeniable stench of financial ruin. "Ms. Vance," the sommelier murmured, "shall I bring the usual vintage from the cellar? The 2009 Bordeaux is drinking exceptionally well this evening." "That will be perfect, Thomas, thank you. And please, bring the seafood tower to start, followed by the Wagyu ribeye, medium rare," I ordered smoothly, completely ignoring the stunned, panicked expressions of my family, who were all too aware that the bottle of wine I had just casually requested cost roughly the equivalent of their remaining combined liquid assets. As Thomas glided away to retrieve the wine, I turned my attention back to Greg, bypassing my mother entirely, choosing to address the architect of their immediate misery. "A temporary liquidity issue, Greg?" I asked softly, my tone conversational, but laced with a razor-sharp analytical edge that made him physically flinch. That is a fascinating way to describe a total, catastrophic collapse of a decentralized Ponzi scheme. Tell me, when the SEC finally executes the pending warrants on the Cayman offshore accounts you've been funneling Ethereum into, do you plan on telling the federal judge it was just a minor misunderstanding of the blockchain architecture? Greg's face went completely ashen, all the blood draining from his features as his mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land, his eyes darting frantically toward my mother, who looked equally bewildered and horrified by my casual, highly specific deployment of federal financial terminology. I don't know what you're talking about," Greg stammered, his voice cracking slightly, the slick, confident crypto bro facade completely shattering under the weight of a woman who actually possessed the data. "It's a bear market. Everyone is taking losses. It's totally standard. There is nothing standard about routing $15,000 of stolen medical funds to a high-risk private collection agency in Las Vegas to cover an underground sports gambling debt, Gregory," I stated, the words dropping onto the pristine white tablecloth like heavy, undeniable bricks, completely sucking the remaining oxygen out of the booth. The silence that followed was not just heavy, it was apocalyptic. Felicity stopped picking at her cuticles, her head snapping up to stare at her husband in absolute, uncomprehending horror, the carefully constructed illusion of her wealthy savior violently disintegrating before her eyes. Beverly froze, her hands still resting on the base of her water glass, her eyes wide as she tried to process the impossible reality that the quiet, submissive daughter she had discarded 3 years ago not only knew the truth about the chemo money, but possessed the exact, terrifying details of the transaction. For a moment, nobody moved, the ambient noise of the restaurant seeming to fade entirely away, leaving only the sound of my calm, steady breathing and the panicked, shallow gasps of a family that had finally been cornered by the truth. You hacked my accounts?" Greg whispered, genuine terror finally replacing his arrogance. "You have absolutely no proof of any of that. You're just a video editor. You're making this up because you're bitter that Felicity married well and you ended up a lonely spinster." I smiled, a genuine, terrifyingly soft smile that did not reach my eyes, feeling a profound, absolute sense of liberation as the final chains of my familial obligation dissolved into nothingness. I am not a video editor, Greg, I said quietly, reaching into my sleek black tote bag and pulling out the beautifully bound heavy leather portfolio I had meticulously prepared. I am the founder and CEO of Vanguard Digital Strategy, a corporate intelligence and forensic auditing firm, and I don't need to hack your accounts to prove you are a fraud. I just have to read the public digital footprints you were too arrogant and incompetent to erase. I placed the portfolio in the exact center of the table, the heavy thud of the leather against the wood echoing like a gavel striking a judge's block. But we are not here to discuss your impending federal indictment, Greg. That is between you and the Department of Justice. I shifted my gaze slowly, deliberately locking eyes with my mother, watching her desperately try to maintain her regal composure as the walls of her entire reality caved in. We are here to discuss the fact that exactly 7 days ago, the predatory equity firm you foolishly signed your life away to, Obsidian Capital Partners, realized your mortgage was a toxic asset and sold the entire debt portfolio to an anonymous holding company called Aegis Sentinel. I paused, letting the silence stretch, savoring the absolute, unadulterated power of the moment, watching my mother's eyes track the gold monogram ring on my finger. I am Aegis Sentinel, Mother. I bought your debt. I hold the original promissory note. I hold the deed. And in exactly 3 days, when the final notice expires, I am the one who is going to formally evict you from the only thing you ever truly loved. The absolute, suffocating silence that followed my declaration seemed to stretch into eternity, freezing the four of us in a tableau of shattered illusions beneath the warm, flickering candlelight of the Sovereign Room, while the rest of the oblivious restaurant continued its low, sophisticated hum of clinking crystal and privileged conversation. I watched the cognitive dissonance violently tear through my mother's mind, her brain fundamentally rejecting the impossible reality that the foundational pillar of her entire existence, the grand, historical Baldwin Hills mansion she used to lord her superiority over everyone in her social orbit, was now legally owned by the very daughter she had confidently left to die in a sterile apartment 3 years ago. "This is a sick, pathetic joke," Beverly finally whispered, her voice completely stripped of its usual booming, authoritative resonance, reduced to a dry, reedy rasp as her eyes darted frantically between my perfectly calm face and the heavy leather portfolio sitting in the exact center of the table. "You printed these documents off the internet, Hazel. You fabricated this entire elaborate lie because you are deeply psychologically unwell and bitterly jealous of your sister's happiness." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice to defend my sanity. I merely reached out with a perfectly steady hand, the heavy gold monogram ring on my index finger catching the dim light, and flipped open the cover of the portfolio, revealing the crisp, notarized legal documents inside. I bypassed the forensic accounting reports and went straight to the property deeds, rotating the binder so it faced her directly, tapping my manicured fingernail against the raised official seal of the county clerk's office and the unmistakable, desperate signatures of both her and my father at the bottom of the Obsidian Capital transfer agreement. "I highly encourage you to call the county clerk's office first thing on Monday morning, Mother," I said smoothly, my tone as gentle and deadly as a velvet-wrapped blade. "Though I suspect you won't need to, considering the final notice of eviction from Aegis Sentinel Holdings was delivered to your front door by armed courier 72 hours ago, explicitly detailing the immediate seizure of the asset due to your catastrophic failure to meet the balloon payment terms you so foolishly agreed to." Beverly stared at the physical proof, her perfectly manicured hands trembling so violently she had to pull them off the table and press them into her lap. The polished, impenetrable mask of the high society matriarch finally cracking, splintering, and completely falling away to reveal the terrified, bankrupt woman hiding underneath. But before Beverly could formulate another desperate rationalization, Felicity, who had been sitting in a state of catatonic shock, suddenly lunged forward across the table, her manicured fingers frantically flipping past the mortgage documents to the heavily tabbed section detailing Greg's financial history. My sister's eyes, usually so vacuous and meticulously curated for the camera, widened in genuine, unadulterated horror as she read the itemized ledgers I had decrypted from the blockchain, tracking the systematic draining of her husband's supposed crypto fortune to pay off massive, hidden liabilities. "Greg," Felicity gasped, her voice trembling, pointing a shaking finger at a specific, highlighted wire transfer receipt that I had intentionally placed near the front. "Greg, this is a receipt from a private collection agency in Las Vegas. This says $15,000 was wired to them exactly 1 day before our wedding." She looked up, her face completely drained of color, her eyes locking onto her husband, who was now actively sweating through his cheap shirt, smelling strongly of stale fear and ruined pride. Did you take Hazel's cancer money? Did you tell my mother you needed it for the drone videography team, but you actually used it to pay off a gambling debt?" Greg shrank back into the leather booth, holding up his hands in a pathetic, defensive gesture, his eyes darting toward the exits as if calculating his chances of simply running out of the restaurant and disappearing into the Seattle night. "Babe, you have to understand. It was a high-leverage situation. I had massive capital tied up in decentralized liquidity pools. The bookies were threatening to show up at the resort in Nassau. I was just trying to protect our perfect day," he stammered, his voice pathetic and whining, every word entirely confirming the horrific truth of his betrayal. Felicity let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, a visceral, ugly noise of pure devastation that turned the heads of several wealthy patrons at the adjacent tables, realizing in one brutal, unforgiving instant that her entire marriage, her social status, and her curated online aesthetic were built on the stolen blood money of her dying sister. "You let my sister go to chemotherapy without a dollar to her name so you could pay off a bookie?" Felicity shrieked, entirely abandoning her poised, high-society persona, slamming her hands down on the table so hard the water glasses violently rattled. "I am married to a broke, gambling criminal? My credit cards are declining at Neiman Marcus. I am being humiliated in front of my friends, and it's because you are a complete, fraudulent loser." I sat back in my chair, resting my elbows on the armrests, observing the explosive, long-overdue implosion of their marriage with the detached, clinical fascination of a scientist watching a predictable chemical reaction finally detonate in a controlled environment. For 33 years, I had been the designated peacekeeper, the emotional sponge forced to absorb and mediate every single one of Felicity's tantrums and my mother's crises. But tonight, I was entirely liberated from that role, allowing their toxic dynamic to consume them while I remained entirely untouched by the flames. Just as Felicity wound up to deliver another screaming insult at her husband, Thomas, the sommelier, materialized at our table with the silent, impeccable grace of a ghost, carrying a silver tray bearing a pristine bottle of the 2009 Bordeaux I had ordered, a corkscrew, and a single crystal wine glass, completely ignoring the volatile, aggressive energy radiating from the 3 other occupants of the booth. "The 2009 vintage, Ms. Vance," Thomas murmured respectfully, presenting the label to me with a slight bow, acting as if my family were entirely invisible. An exceptional choice for the evening. I nodded my approval, watching with serene patience as he expertly extracted the cork, poured a small, ruby-red measure into the crystal bowl, and stepped back to await my verdict. I picked up the glass by the stem, swirling the dark, heavy liquid to aerate it, bringing it to my nose to inhale the complex notes of dark cherry, cedar, and aged leather, before taking a slow, deliberate sip, letting the exquisite $1,000 wine coat my palate, while my mother and sister watched me in a state of paralyzed, agonizing disbelief. "It is absolutely perfect, Thomas," I said smoothly, setting the glass down. "Please pour, and you may bring the seafood tower whenever the kitchen is ready." Thomas filled my glass, gave another short bow, and vanished back into the dining room, leaving the 4 of us alone once again with the suffocating reality of the documents sitting on the table. The surreal cinematic contrast of the moment, Me, sitting in a bespoke Italian suit, calmly tasting one of the most expensive wines in the world, while my family literally crumbled into financial and emotional ash before my eyes, was the precise, devastating pivot I had meticulously engineered for 3 years. Beverly watched me take another sip of the wine, her eyes tracking the movement of the crystal glass, and I saw the exact crushing moment the final remnants of her ego completely surrendered to the terrifying truth of her powerlessness. The arrogant, commanding matriarch, who had dropped my spare apartment key on my glass coffee table and told me I was selfish for wanting to survive cancer, was entirely gone, replaced by an aging, terrified woman who realized she had aggressively bullied the only person capable of saving her from dying in poverty. Her shoulders slumped forward, the impeccable posture she had maintained for decades collapsing in on itself, and a single, heavy tear escaped the corner of her eye, carving a slow, jagged path through her expensive foundation. "Hazel," Beverly whispered, the name catching in her throat, her voice thick with a pathetic, manufactured sorrow that she was attempting to weaponize as a final, desperate shield. "Hazel, please. You have made your point. You are brilliant, you are successful, and we were incredibly, unforgivably foolish. I admit it. I admit everything. But you cannot do this. You cannot throw your own mother and father out onto the street. We are blood. We are family. Your father's heart cannot take the stress of an eviction. He is an old man, Hazel. He loves that house. He loves you." The invocation of my father, the quiet, cowardly man who had spent my entire childhood hiding in his study, willfully ignoring my mother's emotional abuse, and who had ultimately signed the mortgage documents that traded my inheritance for Greg's gambling debts just to avoid a confrontation, did not elicit a single ounce of sympathy from my soul. It only hardened my resolve into absolute, impenetrable diamond. "My father loves his comfort, Mother, not me," I corrected her quietly, my voice devoid of any anger, vibrating only with the heavy, unshakable weight of the absolute truth. "If he loved me, he would not have allowed you to walk into my apartment and steal the money keeping me alive. He would have stopped you. He would have called me. He did absolutely nothing, which is precisely what he has done his entire life. And now he is going to experience the exact, terrifying consequence of his lifelong silence." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table, closing the physical distance between us so my mother could look directly into my eyes and see the vast, empty void where my desperate need for her love used to reside. "And as for blood, Mother," I continued, my words dropping like ice water into the center of the table, "blood is what I was coughing up into a plastic basin in the oncology ward while you were drinking champagne on a beach in Nassau, toasting to a fraudulent marriage funded by my suffering. Blood is the toxic, poisonous expectation you used to chain me to this family, demanding my infinite sacrifice while offering me absolutely nothing in return. I bled for you for 33 years. I am entirely, permanently out of blood." Beverly flinched violently as if she had been physically struck, her hands coming up to cover her mouth as a sob tore through her throat, genuine, agonizing tears finally flowing freely down her face, the realization that her psychological manipulation was completely ineffective, hitting her with the force of a freight train. She reached across the table, her trembling fingers desperately trying to grasp my hand to make any sort of physical, maternal connection. But I calmly and deliberately pulled my hand back, letting her fingers grasp nothing but the empty air above the white tablecloth. "You are an absolute monster," Felicity hissed, her face streaked with her own tears, her makeup running in dark, ugly rivers down her cheeks, lashing out at me because it was easier than facing the reality of the pathetic, broke man sitting next to her. "How can you sit there and drink wine while you destroy our lives? You are supposed to be the strong one. You are supposed to fix things." I turned my gaze to my younger sister, feeling a profound, almost pitying exhaustion at her complete lack of self-awareness, looking at a woman who had never been forced to carry her own weight for a single day of her life. "I am not destroying your lives, Felicity," I stated simply, taking another composed sip of my Bordeaux. "Greg destroyed your life the moment he built an empire on lies. Mother destroyed your life the moment she taught you that your only value was your aesthetic and that stealing to protect your comfort was a justifiable act. I am merely the inevitable consequence of your own actions finally catching up to you." I paused, gesturing gracefully toward the portfolio sitting between us. "I didn't force you into massive debt. I didn't force you to max out your credit cards. I didn't force Mother to sign a predatory loan. I simply purchased the paper you willingly signed. You built this exact guillotine with your own hands, Felicity. I am simply the one politely pulling the lever." As if perfectly orchestrated by the universe, a team of 3 waiters suddenly approached the booth, carrying massive, gleaming silver stands topped with crushed ice, upon which rested the most extravagant seafood tower the Sovereign Room offered, piled high with fresh Maine lobster, dozens of oysters, colossal shrimp, and king crab legs, an obscene, beautiful display of culinary wealth. The waiters expertly arranged the feast on the table, carefully navigating around the heavy leather portfolio containing the family's financial death warrant, placing a silver oyster fork and a linen napkin next to my crystal wine glass before silently retreating back into the shadows of the restaurant. The contrast was entirely devastating. I was surrounded by a literal feast of luxury, perfectly at peace, while the 3 of them sat frozen, starving, and emotionally eviscerated, their entire reality collapsing under the weight of my quiet sovereignty. Greg, who had remained silent since his initial, pathetic defense, suddenly slid out of the booth, his face pale and slick with sweat, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of masculinity or protection. I have to make a phone call. To my lawyer. There has to be a way to restructure this," he mumbled, not looking at any of us, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor as he practically sprinted away from the table, disappearing toward the restaurant's restrooms, leaving his wife and mother-in-law completely defenseless. Felicity watched him run, a look of profound, absolute disgust twisting her features, realizing that the man she had sacrificed her sister's life to marry was not just a fraud, but a profound, pathetic coward who was abandoning her the moment the illusion of his wealth evaporated. Beverly, however, did not look at Greg. Her eyes remained entirely fixed on me, her spirit completely broken, the decades of arrogant entitlement finally burning away to leave nothing but pure, unadulterated desperation. "Please, Hazel," Beverly begged, abandoning her pride entirely, her voice dropping to a harsh, humiliating whisper, tears dripping off her chin onto her vintage Chanel suit. "Please, I will do anything. I will work. I will apologize publicly. I will get on my knees right here in this restaurant. Just give us time. Give us 6 months to sell the house ourselves, to downsize quietly, so we don't have to face the public humiliation of the sheriff throwing our belongings onto the lawn. Please, spare me that indignity." I picked up my silver oyster fork, speared a flawlessly chilled briny oyster, and ate it with slow, deliberate appreciation, savoring the taste of the ocean and the absolute, perfect silence of my own soul, entirely devoid of the guilt she was desperately trying to trigger. "You did not spare me the indignity of sitting alone in a chemotherapy ward, wondering how I was going to pay my rent while poison dripped into my veins," I replied quietly, setting the fork down and dabbing the corner of my mouth with the linen napkin. "You did not spare me the indignity of prioritizing a drone videographer over my life. You made your choices with absolute, ruthless clarity, Mother, and I respected those choices by removing myself entirely from your world." I reached out, placed my manicured hand firmly on the leather portfolio, and slowly pulled it back across the table, sliding it safely back into my sleek black tote bag, the finality of the movement echoing like a coffin lid slamming shut. "You have exactly 3 days before the county sheriff arrives at the Baldwin Hills estate to execute the eviction order," I stated, my voice echoing with the cold, immovable permanence of a mountain. "I highly suggest you spend the remainder of your evening securing a very cheap moving truck, because when Monday morning arrives, every single item left inside that house legally belongs to me. And I assure you, Mother, I will throw it all into the incinerator without a second thought. I watched my mother's shoulders shake, the visceral, ugly reality of her impending homelessness finally shattering the decades of carefully curated arrogance she had worn like a second skin, her tears falling unheeded onto the lapels of her vintage Chanel suit, while the extravagant seafood tower I had ordered sat entirely untouched between us, a monument to the wealth they could no longer access and the daughter they could no longer control. Felicity sat paralyzed next to her, staring blankly at the empty space where her fraudulent husband had been sitting just moments before, her meticulously constructed reality of Miami yacht parties and high society privilege violently collapsing into the undeniable truth that she was married to a coward who had funded her vanity with stolen cancer funds and was currently fleeing through the kitchen of a luxury steakhouse to avoid federal indictment. I did not feel a single flicker of pity, guilt, or obligation. Instead, I felt a profound, absolute stillness in the center of my chest, a quiet, soaring sovereignty that only comes when a woman finally sets down a burden she was never meant to carry in the first place, realizing that the people she had spent her entire life trying to heal were fundamentally committed to their own destruction. For 33 years, I had been the designated shock absorber for this family, the quiet, dutiful foundation they continuously chipped away at to build their own pedestals, conditioned to believe that my worth was intrinsically tied to my utility, that I only mattered when I was writing a check, organizing a crisis, or shrinking myself so Felicity could shine under my mother's adoring gaze. But standing in the crucible of my own mortality, facing chemotherapy completely alone while they danced on a beach in the Bahamas, the desperate, people-pleasing daughter had died permanently, and the woman who replaced her had no use for their manufactured tears or their sudden, desperate invocations of family loyalty. I picked up my crystal glass, took another slow, deliberate sip of the 2009 Bordeaux, savoring the complex, velvety finish of the wine, and then I raised my hand slightly, catching the attention of Tomas, the sommelier, who materialized instantly with the leather-bound checkbook, completely ignoring the weeping woman and the catatonic sister sitting across from me. I pulled a sleek, heavy black metal corporate card from my wallet, a card backed by the massive liquidity of Vanguard Digital Strategy, and placed it on the silver tray, paying for a dinner they couldn't even stomach, exerting the ultimate, devastating financial dominance over a family that had once called me a useless spinster playing on a little computer. As Tomas walked away to process the transaction, Beverly, realizing that I was actually going to leave them sitting in the ruins of their lives without offering a single cent of salvation, did the one thing I never, in my wildest dreams, thought the proud, imperious matriarch of the Baldwin Hills elite would ever do. She slid out of the curved leather booth, her knees hitting the plush crimson carpet of the sovereign room with a soft thud, completely abandoning every ounce of her high society decorum in front of the city's financial elite. "Hazel, please," she sobbed, her hands reaching out to grasp the hem of my tailored charcoal trousers, looking up at me with a face completely stripped of its makeup and its pride, resembling nothing more than a terrified, broken old woman who had finally run out of victims. "I gave birth to you. I am your mother. You cannot let the sheriffs throw me and your father onto the street like common criminals. We have nowhere to go, Hazel. Greg's accounts are frozen, my savings are gone, the credit cards are maxed out. I will do anything you want. I will transfer the title of the house to you. You can own it. Just let us stay in the guest wing. I will work for you. I will clean your house. Just do not do this to your own blood." I looked down at her, staring into the tear-filled eyes that had never once looked at me with genuine pride or affection, unless I was actively serving her needs, feeling the immense, historical weight of all the times she had gaslit me, minimized my pain, and demanded my silence to protect her aesthetic. The sheer audacity of her proposal, offering to let me own the house I already legally possessed, just so she could continue living in her delusion of grandeur, was the final, indisputable proof that she was entirely incapable of viewing me as a human being. I was still just an asset to be negotiated with, a safety net she felt entitled to deploy when her preferred investments failed. I smoothly stepped back, breaking her physical contact with my suit, my posture remaining completely upright and regal, looking down at her kneeling form with an expression of cold, clinical detachment. I reached into my black leather tote bag, bypassed the heavy portfolio containing their financial death warrant, and opened my slim designer wallet, pulling out a single, crisp $20 bill. I held the small denomination between my manicured index and middle fingers, the gold monogram ring catching the ambient candlelight, and I let the bill flutter gently down through the air, watching it land softly on the crimson carpet, mere inches from my mother's trembling knees. "Take an Uber," I said, my voice echoing with the terrifying absolute finality of a judge delivering a death sentence, cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant and freezing the surrounding tables in shocked silence. Because from this moment on, Beverly, we are completely, permanently strangers. I didn't wait for her reaction. I didn't look at Felicity, who was now openly weeping into her hands, and I didn't look back as I turned and walked toward the exit, the sharp, authoritative click of my stilettos against the hardwood foyer, echoing like a definitive punctuation mark at the end of a very long, very painful chapter of my life. Antoine, the maitre d', held the heavy oak door open for me, his expression perfectly neutral, but his eyes betraying a profound, respectful awe, and I stepped out into the crisp, cool Seattle night air, taking a deep, cleansing breath that filled my lungs with absolute freedom. My private driver was already waiting, the engine of the luxury SUV purring quietly, and as I slid into the soft leather back seat, I felt the phantom ache in my chest where the chemo port used to be finally, permanently vanish, replaced by the impenetrable armor of a woman who had successfully reclaimed her own soul. The weekend that followed was a masterpiece of silent, psychological warfare, observed entirely from the serene, climate-controlled sanctuary of my penthouse, while I drank premium matcha tea and watched the digital feeds on my encrypted servers paint a real-time portrait of their absolute destruction. Greg did not return to the mansion after fleeing the restaurant. My data crawlers picked up a massive red-flagged ping on his passport exactly 4 hours later at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, where he had desperately attempted to board a red-eye flight to Dubai using a secondary, hidden bank account he had kept entirely secret from his wife. He didn't make it past TSA. The federal warrants regarding his crypto fraud had officially propagated through the national database, and he was quietly intercepted by federal agents at the gate, handcuffed in a cheap hoodie, and dragged into a holding cell, completely erasing the last microscopic shred of hope Beverly had clung to that he might miraculously fix the situation. Felicity, entirely abandoned by her fraudulent savior and facing the terrifying reality of poverty, spent the weekend having what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown on social media, posting erratic, tearful videos to her private stories, blaming the corrupt banking system and jealous haters for her downfall, until the repo men arrived at the mansion on Saturday afternoon to tow away her leased Range Rover directly from the circular driveway in broad daylight. Through the public county sheriff eviction logs that Vanguard's software continuously monitored, I tracked the frantic, disorganized chaos unfolding inside the Baldwin Hills estate, a sprawling 10,000-square-foot monument to generational pride that my parents were now being forced to pack up in less than 72 hours, with absolutely zero financial resources to hire professional movers. I could perfectly envision my father, Reginald, a man who had spent his entire marriage avoiding conflict by retreating to his mahogany-paneled study, finally being forced to confront the catastrophic consequences of his own cowardice, hauling trash bags full of designer clothes down the grand staircase while Beverly stood in the foyer, screaming instructions and weeping over her antique vases. They had spent their entire lives treating everyone around them, especially me, as disposable commodities, assuming their wealth and social standing insulated them from the basic laws of human decency. But the universe possesses a terrifyingly precise sense of irony, and now they were the ones being aggressively discarded by the very system they had worshipped. By Sunday evening, the digital indicators showed that they had maxed out 2 final subprime credit cards just to rent a mid-sized U-Haul truck and secure a month-to-month lease on a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a deeply undesirable neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. A spectacular, catastrophic fall from grace that would permanently eradicate their standing in the high society circles Beverly had sacrificed her own daughter to remain in. When Monday morning finally arrived, the day of the official eviction, I did not sleep in. I rose at dawn, completely refreshed, operating with a sharp, crystalline clarity that made the air feel electrified, taking my time to shower, moisturize, and select the perfect armor for the final act of this cinematic reclamation. I chose a flawlessly tailored, pristine white crepe suit, a deliberate, powerful visual contrast to the dark charcoal I had worn at the restaurant, symbolizing not mourning, but absolute rebirth, purity, and the unshakable peace of a matriarch stepping into her full power. I drove myself to the Baldwin Hills Historic District in my sleek black sedan, the morning sun casting long golden shadows across the manicured lawns and towering oak trees of the incredibly affluent neighborhood, the same streets I used to walk down feeling like a tolerated interloper in my own family's kingdom. When I turned the corner and pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the estate, the visual confirmation of my absolute victory was already unfolding on the pristine front lawn. 2 black and white county sheriff cruisers were parked haphazardly in the circular driveway, their lights flashing silently in the morning air, a brutal, highly public declaration of financial failure that Beverly's wealthy, judgmental neighbors were undoubtedly watching from behind their drawn silk curtains. The front doors of the mansion were propped wide open, and standing on the edge of the curb, surrounded by a chaotic, pathetic pile of hastily packed cardboard boxes, black trash bags, and a few pieces of antique furniture they couldn't bear to leave behind, were my mother, my father, and my sister. They looked entirely destroyed, their expensive clothes rumpled and stained with the sweat of manual labor, their faces hollow and gray with exhaustion, stripped of every ounce of their arrogant entitlement and reduced to the raw, terrified reality of displacement. I parked my car directly behind the sheriff's cruisers, turned off the engine, and stepped out onto the pavement, the soft click of my heels instantly drawing the attention of the 2 uniformed deputies who were standing on the porch holding clipboards. I walked up the long, sweeping driveway, my white suit gleaming in the sunlight, my posture perfectly straight, bypassing my family entirely without so much as a single glance in their direction, treating them exactly as they had treated me in the oncology ward, like completely invisible, irrelevant background noise. I approached the lead deputy, a tall, imposing man who looked thoroughly bored with the routine eviction process, and smoothly handed him my Washington State driver's license alongside the heavily notarized original transfer deed, proving that Aegis Sentinel Holdings was, in fact, my personal holding company. The deputy reviewed the paperwork carefully, his eyes widening slightly as he connected the massive corporate entity on the foreclosure documents to the fiercely composed, impeccably dressed African-American woman standing before him, executing a multi-million-dollar asset seizure with the casual grace of someone picking up their dry cleaning. "Everything appears to be perfectly in order, Ms. Vance," the deputy said, his tone shifting immediately into one of deep professional respect, completely ignoring the weeping family on the curb behind me. "The occupants have been officially served and have vacated the interior of the premises. The property is now legally yours, clear of all inhabitants. We have secured the perimeter, and all previous locks are scheduled to be changed by a locksmith within the hour." He handed me a heavy brass key, the original master key to the front doors, and I closed my fingers around it, feeling the cold, heavy metal bite into my palm, a physical manifestation of a generational curse finally being broken, realizing that I was no longer the marginalized daughter begging for scraps of affection in this massive house. I was the sole owner, the absolute sovereign of the estate. I thanked the deputy quietly, turned around on the grand marble porch, and finally looked down at my family standing on the curb beside their rented moving truck. Beverly was staring up at me, her face completely unreadable, a mixture of profound shock, lingering terror, and the absolute crushing realization that she was standing on the sidewalk looking up at the daughter she had tried to destroy, who was now standing on the porch of the mansion she used to rule, holding the keys to the kingdom. Felicity refused to make eye contact, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, shivering in the morning air despite the rising sun, while my father simply looked at the ground, utterly defeated, completely stripped of the legacy he had failed to protect because he had lacked the courage to stand up to his wife's vanity. I did not gloat, I did not scream, I did not offer them a single word of parting advice or malicious triumph, because the true power of the matriarch's grace lies in the absolute withdrawal of her energy from those who do not deserve it. I simply stood there in my flawless white suit, framed by the massive oak doors of my newly acquired mansion, observing them with the calm, detached serenity of a woman watching a storm finally pass over the horizon, leaving nothing but clear skies in its wake. As the sheriffs instructed them to finish loading their belongings and vacate the neighborhood, I turned my back to the street, inserted the heavy brass key into the lock, pushed open the grand doors, and stepped inside the vast, silent, completely empty house, closing the door firmly behind me and locking them out of my life forever. The heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the cavernous foyer of the Baldwin Hills estate like the definitive strike of a gavel, sealing the mausoleum of my family's generational vanity and officially marking the absolute beginning of my undisputed sovereignty. I stood perfectly still on the imported Italian marble entryway, the silence of the massive empty mansion wrapping around me not as a suffocating weight, but as a luxurious, impenetrable velvet cloak, completely devoid of the chaotic, toxic, demanding energy that had infected this structure for the past 40 years. The air inside still carried the faint, lingering scent of my mother's expensive floral perfume mixed with the sharp, acidic tang of panicked sweat and cheap cardboard boxes, the olfactory remnants of their desperate, humiliating exodus. But beneath that surface layer of decay, I could smell the raw, elemental scent of old wood, cold stone, and absolute, unadulterated freedom. I began to walk slowly through the sprawling first floor, the sharp, authoritative click of my stilettos against the hardwood deliberately shattering the sacred, hushed reverence Beverly had always demanded in these halls, feeling the immense, intoxicating power of moving through a space where I was finally the master, not the maid. I walked into the grand formal dining room, the walls still painted in that oppressive dark burgundy my mother had chosen to project old-world wealth, the floor marred by deep indentations in the antique rugs where the massive mahogany table used to sit, the very table where I had spent decades serving perfect holiday meals, quietly absorbing their passive-aggressive insults, while Felicity was endlessly praised simply for existing. The ghosts of their entitlement seemed to hover in the dust motes, dancing in the morning light, streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, whispering the old, familiar demands that I shrink myself, that I apologize, that I open my wallet to fix their mistakes. But I simply walked through those phantom memories like mist, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical indifference. I moved into the expansive chef's kitchen, running my manicured hand across the cold granite countertops, pausing at the exact spot by the commercial stove where I used to stand for hours on Thanksgiving mornings, practically killing myself to ensure Beverly's flawless aesthetic was maintained for her high society guests. Realizing with profound clarity that the woman who used to desperately crave their validation in this room was completely, permanently dead, buried under the toxic ash of the chemotherapy they had refused to pay for. I turned on the polished chrome faucet, letting the freezing water rush over my hands, meticulously washing away the invisible residue of their presence. the ritualistic cleansing of a matriarch, preparing to completely eradicate the history of a ruined dynasty to make way for her own empire. I climbed the sweeping, curved grand staircase, my hand gliding effortlessly over the polished mahogany banister, ascending to the second floor and walking directly into the massive master suite that had served as Beverly's inner sanctum, the very epicenter of her narcissistic control over the family. The room was entirely stripped bare, the heavy velvet drapes violently torn down in her frantic packing, leaving the massive bay windows completely exposed to the brilliant, blinding morning sun, illuminating the ugly, faded patches on the walls where her massive portraits and gilded mirrors used to hang, exposing the fact that beneath the opulent decorations, the house was just drywall, wood, and empty space, completely devoid of any intrinsic magic or superiority. I stood in the exact center of her former bedroom, looking out over the manicured, sprawling backyard and the glittering swimming pool, making a quiet, unbreakable vow to the universe that I would not simply move my belongings into the corpse of my mother's life. I was going to surgically excise every single trace of her aesthetic from this property. Just as the toxic chemicals of my cancer treatment had violently purged the rogue, diseased cells from my physical body to save my life, I was going to systematically gut the interior of this colonial monument to vanity, tearing down the oppressive walls, ripping up the stained historical carpets, and shattering the heavy, suffocating architecture that had trapped me in a cycle of servitude for 33 years. Within 48 hours, the pristine quiet of the Baldwin Hills estate was replaced by the deafening, glorious roar of industrial demolition as I hired the most elite, ruthlessly efficient architectural and interior design firm in Seattle to execute a complete, merciless transformation of the property. I stood on the front lawn in my tailored power suits, holding a cup of premium artisanal coffee, watching with profound, therapeutic satisfaction as teams of contractors took sledgehammers to the burgundy walls, violently ripping out the crystal chandeliers Beverly had worshipped, tossing the heavy, ornate colonial fixtures into massive steel dumpsters parked in the circular driveway. I authorized a multi-million-dollar renovation budget without blinking, funded entirely by the massive corporate intelligence contracts Vanguard Digital Strategy continued to secure, instructing the lead architect to completely redesign the interior into a sprawling, ultra-modern, minimalist sanctuary, characterized by vast open spaces, floor-to-ceiling smart glass, natural sustainable woods, and an abundance of pure, unadulterated natural light. For 8 months, while the physical structure of my past was being violently deconstructed and beautifully resurrected, I continued to operate my empire from my downtown penthouse, watching my wealth compound and my professional reputation solidify into absolute, terrifying industry dominance. It was during this period of intense, focused architectural rebirth that the final, pathetic echoes of my family's complete destruction reached my ears, delivered not through tearful phone calls, but through a sterile, routine background intelligence brief compiled by Julian, who knew I preferred my closure delivered purely through verified data rather than emotional hearsay. Julian walked into my glass-walled office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, handing me a single, securely encrypted tablet containing the final updates on the Vance family diaspora, his face maintaining its usual mask of flawless professional detachment. I scanned the digital dossier while sipping my green tea, reading the cold, hard facts of their new reality with the same detached clinical focus I would use to review a competitor's quarterly loss statements. Gregory T. Vance, the arrogant cryptocurrency savior who had stolen my literal lifeblood to pay a bookie, had entirely abandoned his expensive defense attorneys when his remaining hidden funds were completely seized by the Department of Justice, resulting in his total capitulation and the signing of a catastrophic federal plea deal that guaranteed him a minimum of 5 years in a medium-security federal penitentiary, his digital empire reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale in financial fraud textbooks. Felicity, completely stripped of her marital assets, her luxury vehicles, and her curated social media illusion, was legally forced to file for absolute bankruptcy. Her desperate attempts to leverage her former high society connections, resulting in closed doors and politely ignored phone calls, as the wealthy women she once partied with treated the stench of federal indictment like a highly contagious virus. The data showed that my beautiful, pampered younger sister, who had once mocked my freelance career as child's play while I was fighting for my life, was now working full-time at a luxury cosmetics counter in a high-end downtown department store, forced to stand on her feet for 8 hours a day in a stiff uniform, applying expensive makeup to the very women she used to invite to her Miami yacht parties, having to smile and endure their condescending, pitying small talk to earn minimum wage plus commission just to afford her half of the rent. And then there was Beverly and Reginald, the fallen king and queen of Baldwin Hills, currently residing in a cramped, poorly insulated, 2-bedroom apartment situated directly next to a noisy, elevated transit line on the industrial outskirts of the city, a spectacular, crushing downgrade that had completely destroyed my mother's psychological foundation. According to the surveillance metrics, Beverly had not attended a single Sunday service at her prestigious historic church since the day of the eviction, entirely unable to face the devastating, whispered gossip of the congregation, choosing instead to isolate herself in her cheap apartment, stewing in a toxic, suffocating mixture of rage, shame, and the inescapable realization that she had aggressively bullied the only child capable of saving her. My father, stripped of his grand mahogany study and his quiet luxury, had taken a part-time job as a greeter at a massive retail hardware store just to supplement their meager Social Security checks, his absolute cowardice finally rewarding him with the exhausting, humiliating twilight years he entirely deserved. I read the entire report without a single fluctuation in my heart rate, feeling no malicious, villainous glee, nor the slightest microscopic twinge of daughterly guilt. I felt only the profound, settling peace of an equation that had finally been balanced, a universal debt that had been violently and correctly collected. I handed the tablet back to Julian, gave him a brief nod of acknowledgement, and immediately pivoted the conversation to a hostile corporate takeover Vanguard was executing in Tokyo, permanently closing the mental file on my family and completely deleting their existence from the hard drive of my life. A year and a half after the eviction, on a crisp, perfectly clear autumn morning, the massive iron gates of the estate swung open to welcome my sleek black luxury sedan. But the property I drove onto was no longer the oppressive colonial monument to Beverly's vanity. It was a breathtaking, modern masterpiece of architectural sovereignty. The exterior had been transformed with sleek, dark gray stone and massive panels of mirrored glass that reflected the surrounding ancient oak trees, while the interior was a vast, open-concept sanctuary of warm walnut floors, pristine white walls displaying curated modern art, and state-of-the-art security systems that ensured absolutely no uninvited energy could ever penetrate my perimeter. I parked in the newly expanded garage, walked through the massive pivoting glass front door, and breathed in the scent of fresh eucalyptus, expensive leather, and absolute, undisturbed tranquility, feeling a deep cellular resonance with the space that told me I was finally, permanently home. I walked upstairs to my master suite, a massive, sun-drenched sanctuary featuring a private terrace overlooking the city skyline, and walked into the expansive walk-in closet, bypassing the sharp, armored business suits I wore to conquer the corporate world, selecting instead a soft, luxurious, cream-colored cashmere robe that draped perfectly over my healed, completely healthy body. I walked into the massive, spa-like master bathroom, the morning sun illuminating the flawless, clear skin of my face, my natural, silver-flecked hair cut into a sharp, elegant style that perfectly framed the profound, unshakable wisdom in my eyes. Taking a moment to look at the faint, jagged scar on my chest where the chemo port used to be. I did not cover the scar, I did not resent it, and I did not view it as a mark of trauma. I traced it gently with my gold-adorned index finger, honoring it as the sacred physical site of my absolute resurrection, the exact point where the poison entered my body to kill the cancer, and the exact point where the fire entered my soul to burn down my toxic family tree. I walked downstairs to the ultra-modern chef's kitchen, the sleek marble island gleaming under the recessed lighting, and prepared a cup of premium loose-leaf jasmine tea, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who completely owns her time, her space, and her destiny. I carried the delicate porcelain cup out through the massive sliding glass doors onto the expansive back terrace, the crisp autumn air bracing against my face, and stood at the edge of the infinity pool, looking out over the sprawling, manicured grounds that belonged entirely, legally, and spiritually to me. The heavy, exhausting burden of being the unbreakable foundation for people who fundamentally despised my strength was completely gone, replaced by the terrifying, beautiful realization that when you finally stop bleeding to heal those who continuously cut you, you discover that you possess enough power to build an entire kingdom for yourself. They had looked at my quiet endurance and mistaken it for weakness. They had looked at my devotion and mistaken it for stupidity. And they had looked at my survival fund and mistaken it for their inheritance, failing to realize that a matriarch's silence is not a surrender. It is the quiet, meticulous drafting of a blueprint for absolute ruin. I took a slow, deep sip of the hot jasmine tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest, listening to the gentle rustling of the ancient oak trees in my private garden, entirely insulated from the chaos, the poverty, and the desperation of the people who used to call me family. I am Hazel Vance, the founder, the architect, and the sole heir to my own empire, and the ultimate devastating truth they will carry to their graves is that they did not break me when they left me to die in the dark. They simply provided the exact necessary conditions for a queen to finally learn how to reign.